It is a privilege and an honor for me and my panelists to be here to discuss this topic, dissecting the IP awareness disconnect, or is it a libertarian delusion, as I've just retitled it. Thank you for that very provocative presentation that went right before us, Jonathan. That was very interesting. But what we're going to do is have a conversation that tries to carry forward something that we have been working on in this IPAS series for let's see, 3 or 4 years now, right? In 2020, it was myself, Scott Frank, Joyce Ward, Bo Hayden, and Rafael Cordona, who's here talking about a related subject. Last year, online, it was Efrat, myself, Steve Weiner, and Dr. Stephanie Couch from MIT. Now we want to see really, through dissection, as I'm going to lay it down, what the awareness is and where the disconnects may be. Okay, so what is the IP disconnect, as I like to frame this? Well, it is somewhat a lack of coordination, but it's also a lack of communication skills. And this is something that's really been improved upon substantially by, I think, what people have already presented here today and efforts therein. Why is it a timely topic? Well, I think as Tiffany laid out very elegantly in our opening presentation, and as Adam has elegantly spoken to in past presentations, IP is really part of this grand bargain that we have constructed, at least in this economy, and other economies have tried to emulate it. And it works well in market-driven economies. Well, all of us are aware that the whole idea of a market-driven economy is under threat, rather actively, by different forms of governance that we see across the globe. So the way we're going to run this panel is I'm going to have a few thoughts about what I think the dissection will look like, and then I'm going to turn to my panelists who are very talented. Laurie Self is in Washington. She's going to have some thoughts. She's with Qualcomm, and she's on the front line with working with our beloved government. And then we're going to hear from Madeleine Key, who actually works with Stephen Key. She's a journalist and now a marketing specialist and knows a lot about the challenges of this system and the disconnects for small inventors. Before we get to Mark Kokes, who works with Adeia, and he's going to give us some insights on how the system works for those in the entertainment enhancement business, which was part of the Xperi group, right?
Yes.
Okay, so I'll start with the live vivisection. What does the IP awareness disconnect look like? Well, when I look inside the body of what is the awareness building engine that exists, at least in the fields of influence where I tend to navigate, I see a lot of very familiar characters. And these characters have been active over a long period of time, starting right here at our host institution. David Teese wrote a seminal paper in 1986. I still use it in my course, and it's cast a very long shadow about the significance of IP. That's right there in the title of his paper. And the people that carry that forward are here. Efrat is here, Stephen Weiner, Raphael, Adam Massoff, Mickey and Edward Lee from MIT. And there's Lee Fleming here. I mean, this room is full of the people that have been very much the tissue, the connective tissue that have been trying to, at some level, at the higher academy level, trying to build up the tissue and the healthy tissue of IP that we're trying to seed into the next generation. The Hudson Institute, the Hoover Institute, the Lemelson MIT program have all been doing these things, and I leave many entities off my list. Then we can go beyond academia. And as I look inside the corpus, I see the Michelson Institute, who supported us for a long time, the Lemelson Foundation, which is the legacy of my co-inventor, Jerry Lemelson, the United States Patent and Trademark Office, and even today we're learning about some of their pro bono activities that we should know more about. So to the extent that we're all learning about it in this room, the body is well. And then there's WIPO, the European Patent Office, the Singaporean Patent Office, all of the important government institutions, the AIPLA, the Intellectual Property Owners Group, the US IPA. I can go on and on here. But Tiffany sort of triggered me. It turns out that amongst the least represented communities traditionally, there are self-agency groups. that started fully and of their own volition. And that's Calvin Flowers at the Chicago Inventors Group. And it happens with your own agency. Now, going beyond what are those, we see the inventors and the investors themselves. Bruce Hinman's here from Aon. We heard from Jeremy Chen at Meta, and there's others that are flowing in and out of our community. And so what I see in summary, from my point of view, of where the disconnect is, it isn't the corpus. The body is healthy, and it's getting stronger, and the message is getting out. The tissue is healthy. There's stronger and more growing organs, as I'd like to analogize. And much of the lifeblood is flowing through the system in the form of inventors and the Tiffanys and the others that we heard from already. However, the environment and sort of the air that the body needs to really thrive is under threat. The system itself, as others have already stated, seems to be in a precarious situation. So that's the result of my view of this dissection. And to give us a much broader perspective on it, I want to turn over to Laurie first. Laurie Self, who's in Washington with Qualcomm, and ask her for what her thoughts on what this dissection looks like.
Sure, and I'm sorry not to be there in person, but thank you very much for having me. And by the way, I hope you can hear me well. If you can't, please let me know.
All good, Laurie.
Okay, great. So just to give a 2-minute overview of who Qualcomm is and why we care so deeply about these issues. So Qualcomm is the world's leading inventor, developer of core wireless communications technologies, and we have what is probably the most valuable patent portfolio in mobile technologies in the world. And that R&D footprint originated with our founding in 1985. We were the quintessential R&D intensive startup attempting to pioneer technologies that would transform wireless communications. And that has remained our position even as we have grown into a very large, mature company, which is unusual. As folks in this room, I'm sure, are no doubt aware, the vast majority of kind of long horizon, truly disruptive R&D in this country originates with entrepreneurial startups, research universities, and the like. So the fact that we have maintained that kind of mission around high-risk, long-horizon R&D is unusual. And what has allowed us to maintain that R&D leadership position is no question our patent system, our very strong patent system. And I think it's no coincidence that Qualcomm was founded in 1985 at a time when we were, as a country, strengthening our patent system in very significant ways. Unfortunately, what we've seen over the last 10 years, I think, is a gradual erosion of the strength of the U.S. patent system. And I'll talk about that in a minute. So Qualcomm invests about 20% of our revenues every year in foundational R&D. There's about 10 years of pre-commercial R&D that precedes each new generation of cellular standards. We're in the midst of the 5G standardization process. That is another 10 years process, which again involves continuous research investments in what will be the 5G standard. And at the same time, we are now investing in what will be the 6G standard. And just by way of kind of geopolitical context, if you will, what has changed significantly in the 5G era, if you will, vis-a-vis previous generations of standards, is we've seen Chinese companies really make a significant move up that R&D value chain. In previous generations of cellular standards, China emerged as an important implementer of standardized technologies, cellular technologies, but it's really only in the 5G era where they've emerged as an important investor in R&D. And that creates a real tension for market-based, democracy-based, if you will, companies like Qualcomm in that we self-fund our R&D. In other words, we use our patents and our patent licensing revenue to continue those R&D investments, and China has a very different dynamic in terms of how it funds R&D. So that's just by way of context. It sort of speaks to kind of who we are as a company and why we care so deeply about these issues. In terms of the theme of this panel, the disconnect, you know, what immediately occurred to me when I saw the theme of this panel is that there is an ongoing disconnect that I confront daily in Washington in the policy space between this country's recognition of the importance of these emerging technologies, both from an economic security point of view, as well increasingly from a national security point of view. For those of you who follow the conversation in Washington, you know, there is a very intense focus on technologies like 5G from a national security, geopolitical, competitiveness point of view, while at the same time, our government, unfortunately, and often our Congress, are embarking upon and pushing through policies that are actually detrimental to the intellectual property system and those of us that depend on intellectual property to maintain R&D investments. And again, you know, we're a mature company, but you know, we can't maintain R&D investments without a strong intellectual property system. That same dynamic is even more intense for you know, the small R&D you know, entrepreneurial startup community, where historically patents have played an important role in incentivizing private capital investments. And obviously research universities face those face their own challenges as well. So there is this kind of profound, what some have characterized as a kind of cognitive dissonance between this increasing awareness of why technology matters from a national security, global competitiveness point of view, while at the same time, over the last 10 years, you know, we have seen this kind of a steady chipping away at the strength of our intellectual property system. And again, my focus is primarily on patents, through legislation, through regulatory changes, through Supreme Court precedent, through policies, et cetera. And that is a profoundly challenging dynamic for those of us that are trying to maintain that U.S. R&D leadership position. If you want to unpack, you know, why that cognitive dissonance, if you will, exists, I think there are many factors we could point to. Certainly, the academic literature as it pertains to IP, I think, is often disconnected, if you will, from the reality of how an innovation economy functions. There's clearly a disconnect or divide, if you will, in terms of business models, how companies use intellectual property, how they view intellectual property. You know, we are often, one of the questions I get often is, well, why does Qualcomm take such a strong stance in favor of intellectual property rights while other large tech companies have a very different view? And of course, that really speaks to business model and the role of patents in driving internal R&D, you know, how you use that R&D. Is it to, you know, do you disseminate it broadly? Do you instead kind of hold it tight to maintain competitiveness? So there are lots of factors that contribute to what is ultimately that disconnect at the policy level. But for this audience, I would just highlight that disconnect as something that's you know, incredibly important in terms of, you know, whether the United States, whether our friends throughout the world can maintain leadership in these technology spaces that are, you know, so important in every aspect of our economy and every aspect of our daily lives. So I will stop there, but I, you know, happy to say more, but I think hopefully that will give you at least a bit of context.
Yes, Laurie, thank you very much for that sort of letters from the front line in Washington. I now want to turn to Mark Kokes, who's going to give us a similar perspective about this disconnect from the experience industry.
Sure. Yeah. So thank you guys again for having me. I've been fortunate in my career to work both on the life sciences side and the high tech side. So I've seen a disconnect from a couple of different perspectives. I think, Kim Richards and I were to give a talk last week at IPBC EU in London. And ultimately, that similar topic was kind of at the forefront of that conversation at the time, was the IP disconnect in the boardroom between our respective leaders of our organizations. Again, I've been in small companies, I've been in big companies, some that are IP savvy and some that aren't. But the reality of that situation is honestly that I believe that majority of the boards are focused on tangible assets, the equipment, the products and stuff, and lesser to extent on the intangible assets like intellectual property. And I think it was Brian Hinman's company, Aon, had a report that they put out a couple of years ago, if I'm not mistaken, that basically suggested that intangible assets comprise 5 times the value of the corporate value in the S&P 500 compared to tangible assets. And I think that's an important fact to realize. I think we're focused in some instances on the wrong thing. And those are for the companies that can actually have an intellectual property play, the licensing businesses and such like this. For those that are less fortunate that don't play directly in IP, I think it's a far worse situation. More recently, I have seen an interest in attracting intellectual property professionals to boards, so that's somewhat reassuring. I think so. Maybe the tide is turning in that context, but I'm not sure. I don't have enough data. On the life sciences side, I was going to share a story with you guys because I think it's really interesting. It's a testament to the fact that the disconnect exists between the USPTO and our government in many instances, particularly around international treaties that bind us to certain ideologies. And so, my prior job, I was working at a large pharmaceutical conglomerate in Los Angeles. And we had developed immuno-oncology drugs, therapeutics, and research tools. And as a matter of fact, to hold a patent in the United States on a therapeutic or even a research tool, I have to ultimately place a molecule, a cell, some biologic in a patent deposit. And what happens under the context of a treaty that the U.S. participates in, the Budapest Treaty, which was, I think, dated back to the 70s, was that it was intended to do good. It actually did quite a bit of harm. The premise is that to hold a U.S. patent, and if you want to extend those patent rights into other geographies, that the patent offices in respective geographies should be able to share these cells freely amongst themselves to try to expedite the access of rights in those respective geographies. However, you have agencies, entities backed by the U.S. Patent Office, and these that are called patent depositories that actually hold these molecules, these cells and such. And some of these are operated in a way that they're for profit, which seems like that's just counterintuitive. And these entities, they sell your cells to third parties under the Budapest Treaty for quote-unquote research purposes. Well, any Chinese company, Russian company, pick your favorite country, can create a research institute in the United States and gain access to your technology for pennies on the dollar, all right, and then take a vial of your cells back to their respective geographies where you may or may not have patent rights and basically do what they want with the technology. And so that's sufficiently disturbing, particularly in the biotech and pharmaceutical community, because you can end up with competition and companies that basically have your tech, made modifications to your respective cell lines and such, and then are running trials in therapy for therapeutics with the FDA in the United States or otherwise. And so, I think, again, to me, that's one out of everything that I've seen in my time in the high-tech world and the life sciences world, that's one of the biggest disconnects, is how can the U.S. Patent Office enable federal regulations that allow for things like that to happen.
Well, thank you, Mark. Now, to be fair to our friends at the Patent Office, I think that most of those treaties probably struck by the Department of State, so there's plenty of blame to go around.
Yeah.
But thank you for that perspective. Next, I want to invite Madeleine Key, who works with a lot of individual inventors and can give us that perspective, as well as the difficulty associated with licensing.
Certainly. Just to piggyback a little bit on what Laurie was saying earlier, I do feel like the tide has shifted in the last 10 years, making it more difficult for independent inventors to assert their patent rights, and that's definitely contributed to a disconnect that I alluded to earlier of what a patent is supposed to be for and enable you to do, and how difficult that's really become, whether it's agreeing to have attorneys represent you on contingency or not being able to get an injunction. And you see that revealed really directly in some members of the independent inventor community who are saying, well, why patent at all? I think that reaction is extreme and unhelpful, and I'm not supportive of that idea at all. But I think we have to pause and recognize and say the very lifeblood that we know produce innovation, which are individuals and small groups that generate truly transformative technologies, historically are kind of crying out for help in a lot of different ways. I think the disconnect also exists because people don't identify very readily with being an inventor. And I've now begun asking every inventor, serially successful, many having lots of patents, have started companies, et cetera, when did you start thinking of yourself as an inventor? And typically these people have been inventing and solving problems for a very long time, often even from children. But it wasn't necessarily until they got their first patent issued that they've claimed ownership over that word. And so I think when we, and even talking to my dad, he's had difficulty kind of embracing that. He's like, well, I'm not Tesla, I'm not Edison, I'm not a real inventor, I'm not one of these. And we've kind of put some of these inventors on such a pedestal that there's just a disconnect between people even stepping into that role and claiming it. So I don't necessarily see that being popular with young people, or saying, I want to be an inventor, or that's even a job you can be. And I think that that's a little bit problematic. I think it's a lot problematic, actually. Certainly, you can be an inventor without having a patent, but a patent creates a record, it creates evidence, you can share your invention with other people. I also think the patent industry has been subject to a lot of really effective bad press for a long time now. I think the patent troll narrative was unbelievably clever in its just painting of this very specific good versus evil. Patents are being used to extract value from companies that actually, have products that you like, almost demonizing the licensing business model, which is really funny that people online will call us patent trolls when you're just trying to, derive some monetary value from what you've invented. Even more recently related to the vaccine, you're seeing the narrative that big pharma is greedy and they just want all the profits for themselves, and it's the patents that are the problem. If we got rid of the patents, somehow this issue would solve itself. And I think that there needs to be a bit of a groundswell, and although there are remarkable organizations who've been creating really nuanced situational resources to say, hey, if you're trying to solve this problem, if you're trying to start a business, here's how you might use IP. We need a broader messaging around the value that anyone who works in the space is intimately aware of. It feels very American to me to celebrate IP, to celebrate idea ownership. And I think there's a reality in which things are also so deeply politicized in the country that it doesn't feel like right now people are really celebrating anything having to do with the US in a shared or national way. I think, not to call out the attorneys in the industry who do so much of the educating about IP, but I often find that there's a disconnect between the resources that are created. The jargon can be kind of obtuse. Things are often written in a very academic way so that it's difficult to penetrate. And to me, that is really unhelpful because it perpetuates this idea that the IP industry is just talking to itself. And I think that it needs to really go beyond people who are already very sure of the value of IP to say, no, truly, let me tell you a story, let me make it engaging, let me show you someone who looks like you, who's benefited from these amazing tools. And I think that hit most of my points.
Okay. Thank you, Madeleine. As you say that, someone this morning sent me a publication entitled Invention as the Foundation of the Nation's Wealth. Okay. And it was written right at the time that the United States had solved and invented a rabies vaccine. And this was not soon after the Spanish flu pandemic. And this was in Scientific American. It was published on June 14th, 1919. But it's quite a drumbeat for how this system is going to help us going forward. Madam Journalist, we need more of this. So to the extent that we can help you do that. But my first question really is for Laurie. So Laurie, you're the one who has to navigate the halls of Washington on a daily basis. You know what's trying to be done. You know what meetings like the IPAS tried to achieve and what Bruce and others are trying to do through this center. What more can we do to help the disconnect be bridged in Washington?
And let me, oh gosh, I wish there were a silver bullet to solve that problem. But let me just build off of some of the comments that were made. So first of all, I think it's incredibly important to reshape the narrative, to change the narrative, just to build off of Madeleine's comments. It has been stunning to me how effective the troll narrative has been in Washington over the past decade, even though that narrative time and time again has been empirically proven to be false. And when I say that, what I mean is the studies, the data, that so forth that were put out to kind of create this this sort of demonizing narrative, I think, to borrow Madeleine's term, that sort of painted the patent system as, fraught with abuse, fraught with litigation abuse, with almost extortionist type behavior. If you look at the statistics over the past decade, really since the beginning of our patent system, there's simply no evidence of that kind of rampant misuse of the patent system. And in contrast, what there is very strong evidence of is the fact that the patent system, the United States patent system, has been the most democratic, most successful property rights-based system of innovation in the world, because it has laid the foundation for individuals, for small businesses, for universities, for the little guy, so to speak, to participate in the innovation economy, to attract capital investments, to commercialize innovations, to license innovations, really creating a kind of specialized, diversified system of innovation that harnesses, the creativity, the inventiveness that's innate in all of us. And that becomes a kind of counterbalance, if you will, to what we have seen in other countries throughout the world, where you have, a handful of companies or a handful of entities that sort of dominate the economy. So, I think what has to change, and of course what many of us have been trying to change in terms of more principled research in this space, more principled narrative in this space, more principled advocacy in this space, but we've got to kind of reclaim, if you will, the moral high ground that our intellectual property system, that our system of inventors historically has occupied, in this country. I will say at the same time, however, what we're seeing and what we have seen over the past decade is not new. If you look at the history of the patent system, you see these kind of periods of IP skepticism, patent skepticism, I mentioned that Qualcomm was founded in 1985. The period, between the 30s and the 70s was a kind of low point for the patent system in this country. And we've seen, similar kind of ebbs and flows, if you will, in terms of the strength of the patent system, often as a result of, how we as a country think about our system of innovation and patent rights. But what's critically important, I think, because these issues, what was different in 1930 versus today is, innovation is truly an issue of geopolitical it's a geopolitical imperative more so than at any other point in our history. And what's also changed is that we are critically reliant on the private sector to fund our innovation economy. We are no longer at a point in time where, the biggest innovations are going to be funded by the US government. Those innovations are going to come out of the private sector, and that means that our intellectual property system is critically important. So I think what has to change is promoting a fact-based, reality-based dialogue in Washington around these issues that, that also kind of speaks to all of the policies that are now critically important to innovation leadership in this country. Intellectual property is at the forefront, but there are today a variety of US policies that impact our intellectual property rights beyond what the statute itself says, beyond what PTO does.
Okay.
So I'll stop there. Go ahead.
Thank you very much, Laurie. I want to turn similar question to Mark, okay? Because we have the USPTO's attention today. And I'd like to know what exactly we could possibly do for something like the Budapest Treaty, where you swam in that water. What could be done in the context of that industry to actually try and retip the scales in what might be a fairer direction?
Yeah, I think again, having spent time and talking with the members of the Senate Judiciary Committee and the House and White House as well, there is, I think, a handful of things that could be addressed. I mean, first of all, people have to get on the same page. I mean, again, when American companies are suffering, and some entities, especially during the course of the pandemic, going under because there's unfair competition in the marketplace. Like I said, that seems like an issue that would be across the board, and that the Democrats and Republicans would work together to resolve that. But when most of my experiences have been, you do the 5-minute loop around the Senate building to make have your conversation, and the reality of it is that one senator doesn't want to work with another one, and you have to find someone in their specific geography that has a similar issue and build a consortium and consensus around this stuff. And I understand the premise of that, but at the same time, like I said, American ingenuity is being taken on a daily basis. So.
Okay. One last question for Tiffany here, and then when we'll open it up for audience questions. Okay. So again, we've heard about these resources that are available through our public institutions, right, to help the small inventor, right? I'm curious, how easy is it really to use these resources, if you have any experience with that? Or is it something that really figures into the calculus of how we help the under-resourced inventor compete? So how do we do that?
Okay. I mean, I do think there are incredible resources available. I mean, all you have to do is take a look at the USPTO's website to realize they're putting on 20, 30, 40 events a month, sometimes almost seemingly on a daily basis, saying, come, talk to us, call us, here's our number. I mean, I find that to be really inspiring. I don't know that, I'm not sure how many inventors are truly taking advantage of that. I think they might perceive themselves as sometimes in opposition to the patent office because you're negotiating with your examiner and they're rejecting your claims, but you get a little further along, you realize, no, they're very much on your side. I think the issue with sustaining inventors taking advantage of resources is the process is inherently very iterative. You have one question, you maybe get some information, and then you're just on to your very next one. And so the reason why InventRight, Stephen's company, exists, which has coaching, is because having a mentor who has experience, who has gone through the process before, who has that perspective to be able to say, okay, let's not blow this out of proportion. Here's the right way to respond. Here's what to expect. I often find that resources are maybe not being as real with inventors as they could be, and I find that challenging in our own work because this process is hard enough as it is for anyone to succeed, that if you tell everyone up front just how hard it is and just how unlikely it is, well, you've zapped someone's enthusiasm and energy to begin trying in the first place. And so I feel like that there's a lot of ways to encourage inventors, and hearing about the patent pro bono program is amazing because that's that dialogue of being able to have a relationship with someone, your patent practitioner, who's going to help you learn, help you grow along the way. Yeah.
Thank you, Madeleine. I think this is actually another great example of a program that I think was probably put in place eight years ago or so as part of the 2011 Act, and we really all should try to figure out how to make it work better. But it's not so easy to do. Okay, Bruce, now is the time to open it up for questions. Is that? Sure. Okay, so we'll take questions from the floor about this subject, just dissecting this disconnect. For any of my panelists, you got fantastic people here who actually are in really great positions to shed light on this. So anyone who has any questions, we welcome them.